Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to my watercolor techniques tutorial. In this short tutorial, I wanted to discuss 4 different ways that we have of applying paint to our watercolor paper. This first technique is called wet into wet. It's one of my favorite techniques. It really speaks to one of the magical qualities of watercolor paints when we let the paints blend together. I start off by wetting the piece of paper that I want to paint, and I wet it really generously. I want to show you just how wet this paper is here. If the water is pooling up like that, you might want to run your dry brush across it just to lift out a little bit of that water. When we apply wet paint into a wet surface, the ideal time is not when the water is pooled up on the top of the surface, but when it has started to sink into the surface slightly. We want our paper to still have a nice shine to it, but not have so much water pooled up on the top of the surface. I'm going to pick 4 random colors for this demonstration. Here I'm applying burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is a red-based brown color and slightly granulating. My next color is Quinacridone Purple. Quinacridone Purple is a really smooth color, no granulations at all. And you can see from the puddles on my palette that I'm applying them at a milky consistency. My puddles of paint are not really watered down and they're not thick. And the last color I am applying is Permanent Red. I let them blend together, and since I'm painting them at a nice consistency, they travel slowly diffusing into that wet surface. By controlling how wet the paper is and how wet our paint is, with this technique of wet into wet, we can allow colors to run into each other in a controlled way. For the next technique, I'm showing wet into dry. Wet paint onto a dry surface. I'm using the same 3 exact colors throughout all of these exercises. But here you can see how the colors stay put where my brush puts them down. I don't have those soft diffused edges that I have in the wet into wet example. With wet into dry, the colors are much more saturated. And you have ultimate control because they stay put on that dry paper where you put them and they don't travel anywhere else. With the next technique I'm showing you, it's dry into wet. So again, I'm wetting my paper, getting it nice and saturated. And then I'll apply dry paint. I'm still applying burnt sienna, quinacridone purple, and permanent red. Watercolor paint can't be absolutely dry. It has to be at least wet enough that I can lift it out of the well and release it from my brush onto the paper. Painting with drier paint like this into a wet surface gives you the diffused edges of painting wet into wet, but it gives you more control over the shape. The paint tends to travel less when you paint with it thicker on your brush. You can see here the difference between the wet into wet above and the dry into wet below. On the example above, the wet into wet, the paint travels much further. It stops traveling when the water on the paper finally evaporates and the paint starts to dry. And in this last example, I'm painting dry into dry. That first swatch that I did in burnt sienna was done with milky consistency paint, but then you saw me dry out my brush on my towel and load it up with that burnt sienna, and you can see that it's darker than the one above it. Also, the drier our paint, the more our brush strokes show up. So if you look at the example above, wet paint onto a dry paper, compared to the example below, dry paint into dry paper, you can see that the example above, wet into dry, doesn't show the brush strokes. It's a much smoother application. Each one of these techniques has its own use, and you can see its own results in watercolor. By learning these techniques and understanding the different effects you can create, you'll have ultimate control over your watercolor application. And now I want to show you a few really common mistakes that happen with these techniques. So the first technique I want to show you is painting into wet, wet into wet. So again, I am wetting the surface of the paper. Then using my three colors, burnt sienna, quinacridone purple, and permanent red. You can see here I'm thickening up that puddle a little bit. I don't want this to be too watery. I apply it at a milky consistency. I do the same with the purple and the same with the red. Ideally, we would stop touching this paint until it has dried. If it starts to dry and you go in and touch it with your brush fully loaded with water, like I'm doing here, you will start to create blossoms. That's those funny shapes that happen when we touch an area we've painted with a brush that has a higher water to paint ratio than the area we're touching into. You can see those blossoms starting to develop even further. A blossom is essentially water hitting that paint and pushing the pigment to the edges, creating these very organic, watery shapes. On this next example, above that, I'm painting wet paint into dry. And again, I'll make the same mistake here. If I go back in and touch those areas with a brush that has more water to paint than the area I've painted, you can see again, it starts to create blossoms. So what do we have to do to avoid these blossoms? One way to avoid them is to let that first layer completely dry before you come in and do anything on top of it. Another way to avoid blossoms is to make sure that when you go back in and touch areas that are not completely dry, that you have more paint in your brush than the paint to water ratio that you've already painted. Then you can drop paint in. But if you're dropping in water and paint and there's more water, you're going to risk blossoms. In that third example I just painted, I wanted to show you what happens when you add paint to an area where the water is still pooling on top. Remember, you want to give your paper a chance to absorb some of that water. And in that third example, in the lower right-hand corner, you can see how much water was on that paper. It's still pooled up on top, and then I touched watery paint into it. And then in this last example, I'm adding the same three colors to a wet surface. So again, wet into wet. And even though that is thicker paint, it has the same results when I go in and touch it with paint that is too watery. You can see I'm going in and touching those areas before they've had a chance to dry, and my brush just has entirely too much water on them. I'll give these a chance to dry and then you can see what they've done. The blossoms can work to great effect in some paintings, and many watercolor artists will create blossoms on purpose. You just want to be able to control if you want the blossom or not. One way to avoid blossoms altogether is to not go back into an area that you've painted to paint again until the original layer is completely dry. If that first layer is completely dry, then you can come in and paint right over it. You can paint watery or dry, and I'll show you that next. And another way to avoid blossoms is to never touch an area that is just damp with a wet brush. If you've painted an area and it's still relatively wet and you're dipping your brush into the same puddle of paint so that the consistency of water to paint is exactly the same as what is on your paper, you can go back into that area and paint without getting a blossom. Once that area starts to dry, avoid going back into it. If after it has dried completely, you're not happy with your results, you can do a second layer called glazing. Or lastly, you can enjoy the unpredictable qualities of blossoms and include them in your paintings. They can look quite remarkable, so play with these techniques and decide what works for you. Lastly, I wanted to show you glazing technique. I'm taking one of those mistake samples and glazing it with water. Be sure you're touching your brush to the paper lightly and not reactivating that paint that's underneath. Even if it's completely dry, if your brush stroke is aggressive, it will reactivate that paint and possibly lift it. After adding my water to where I want to glaze, I can come back in and add the paint. In effect, this is again wet into wet, but I have to paint it slightly darker than that original layer in order to cover some of those areas I may not like. This does cover blossoms, but it requires you to go darker, and maybe it was an area where you wanted to stay light. Trying to get the area painted correctly in the first layer is always ideal, but just know that if it doesn't work out, which it often doesn't, we can come in and do a second layer easily, as I'm doing here. Glazing in layers like this is a really common watercolor technique and allows you ultimate control in building up value and color. Here are the examples that I showed of common mistakes we make with these washes. And here's what it looked like after I went in and glazed a couple of those samples with a second layer of paint. So here is one of the examples with a second layer on it, which has obviously covered up some of those blossoms. And this is a close-up of the example where I painted paint into an area where the water was still pooled up on top. And you can see just how much that paint has diffused and lightened and faded considerably. This is the example where I created blossoms and then came in and did a second layer on top. I waited for that first layer to be absolutely dry, then did a wash of water and dropped in paint all over again. I kept the paint fairly light, so some of the earlier blossoms and markings are showing through, but it does have a lovely effect and glow to it. This last close-up is of the area where I painted wet paint into dry paper, and once that paint had started to dry, I touched it with watery brush and created these slight blossoms. I think they work well here, and it's fun to experiment with the different effects you can get dropping water in or wet paint into areas at different stages of the drying process. Ultimately, all these techniques and even blossoms and mistakes can work beautifully in our painting. It helps to understand what we're going for and to practice the different techniques of ways to apply paint to paper. I hope you found this tutorial informative and helpful. Thanks for joining me.